Hey everyone, thank you so much for coming out today and for inviting me to speak to you. I feel far less qualified than the two remarkable MPs that we just heard from to lecture anybody on Australian democracy. I'm a voter, I guess, but I'm certainly not an expert other than, like every other Aussie and most of us in this room, actively participating in it myself once every 3 or 4 years. So I thought I would touch on something though that we've already heard in a way from both other speakers and indeed from you, Sherbin, in your remarks earlier too, and from Exans as well. And that is the importance of the rule of law. And I guess I want to come at it from my own personal experiences, having both lived in a country wherein thankfully we do have the rule of law, and as Keith said, it's not perfect, but it exists, and it exists to this extent in Australia that we just take it for granted. The basic fundamental concepts like separation of powers, the fact that the judge is at least supposed to be an impartial adjudicator in any court proceeding, the presumption of innocence, innocent until proven guilty. These kind of fundamental concepts, they're necessary for any democracy to succeed. I don't think, I was trying to think of examples of imperfect democracies which did not have, the rule of law, and I thought India, Pakistan, there are a few out there which have severe problems with the rule of law, but those principles are still enshrined constitutionally in those countries, and there is still a recognition that this is needed. Obviously in Iran, you have the inverse of this, and I'm sure many people in this room have themselves experienced the absence of the rule of law in a country like Iran, or indeed any repressive authoritarian structure or regime where everything I've just said is flipped on its head. The idea of an impartial judge is almost comical. And I was in 2 prisons in Iran, and I actually learnt a lot about Iranian society, not just from Evin prison, the famous prison where political dissidents and security prisoners are kept, but from Qaqortoq prison, which was kind of a standard public prison, mostly populated by criminals or people who'd committed minor offences, not political prisoners, not the elites of the Iranian political society who might be in opposition to the regime. And so these everyday Iranians taught me a lot as well, and I learned a lot about the corruption of judges. I learned a lot about the absence of the rule of law from Qaqortoq. Just hearing about, you were accused of theft, you were accused of bouncing checks or fraud or something like that. What would your experience in the legal system be? And prior to that, all I'd heard about was political dissidents, high-value security prisoners. Obviously, their trials are going to be heavily politicised. But what if you stole a car? What if you were dealing drugs? Something like that. Even these low-level, non-political cases were heavily politicised too. And such people faced, egregious injustices in court as well. And the lack of the rule of law really pervaded the entire justice system in Iran, whether or not the crime was politicised or not. And that goes from, being able to bribe judges literally with wads of cash, all the way to the ideological appointment of judges. And the fact that it's not your qualifications, it's your ideological credentials. It's, who you're connected to, who your friends are, who your family members are maybe, who you've pledged your allegiance to, the level of religiosity with which you live your life, and that's very heavily vetted, and your family members are vetted and everything. This determines your appointment. A cynic would also say your willingness to rubber stamp any order that comes from higher up, convict this person, sentence this person to death, whatever. Yes, rubber stamp, done. That will probably see you well if you're a judge in Iran as well. So, getting an insight into this system, especially from someone whose background was growing up in a country with the rule of law, you have this kind of inherent sort of expectation, even when you're on trial in a very corrupt country like Iran, that, well, I haven't done anything wrong. I can present evidence in my own defence. I'll be able to defend myself in court and show everybody that I'm innocent, and they'll let me go. You have this kind of ingrained into your mind. Most of you in this room will have the inverse. And I've spoken to Iranians who've migrated to countries like Australia, and said that it's really hard to undo that expectation that when I am accused of something, I'm guilty and I must prove my innocence, rather than the opposite, that I am innocent until proven guilty and those accusing me must furnish evidence that I am guilty. So kind of undoing a lot of this is a real challenge. And when I reflect on the future of Iran and, you know, khoda kone, one day this country will be free, and you will have the ability to start to think about these structures that Michael Sokka and Keith Wallahan mentioned. How are you going to structure your future democracy? I do fear, you know, living among hundreds, even thousands of inmates who have been through this system and speaking to many ordinary Iranians who have been subjected to their entire lives this lack of rule of law and this lack of democratic processes. That mental shift that is required when and if this regime falls, I hope it won't be too much, and that temptation for revenge, for mob justice, for, you know, these guys have been stringing us up for decades, let's string some of them up too. Let's hunt everybody down who's wronged us and put them through the same process we were subjected to. My concern is that that might ensue because, as we've seen throughout history in many other contexts, and including the 79 revolution, I mean, this is what the Islamic Republic did when it took over, right? You know, it spent more than a decade, even to this day, hunting down its opponents and making an example of them outside of the rule of law. So I think it's really important for the Iranian people to develop not only an understanding of democracy and the kind of democracy you'd like to build in Iran, but some of these, you know, these finer points of justice. And it's not for me to be instructive necessarily on this point, but I do think that temptation will always be there. And, you know, I understand it. Look at those two judges that were assassinated last month. Can anyone tell me they didn't deserve it? Can anyone tell me that they weren't just a little bit, not happy, but feeling like they got their just desserts maybe in this essentially extrajudicial killing? So it's that the temptation is there, and I think it's really, really incumbent on everyone, especially, you know, those of us in this room, and I commend IAR for the work you're doing in trying to develop a culture of democracy in the diaspora that will hopefully filter back into Iran itself. But thinking about how justice can be achieved and how structures around the rule of law can be constructed in a post-regime Iran in a way that preserves this culture, preserves the idea of innocent until proven guilty, impartial judges, a lack of political interference in justice. These kinds of concepts that we take for granted in Australia.